Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Christopher Dungan. I'm the Middle East Regional Director for Fiduci, based in Dubai. And with me today is Mohammed Al-Dabashi, who is co-managing partner of Al-Dabashi Gray, a full-service law firm, also in Dubai. And he distinguishes himself by having been the only Emirati lawyer I know to have been to Jersey, and he's a very accomplished man, and much to my dismay, younger than me. So today we will be having a fairly informal conversation about the values of offshore structuring for Middle East-based clients, and we will take questions at the end. There's a chat function on the application here, so if you can type in questions as and when, and we'll get to those at the end. And also in the files section, you can download the Fiduci and Al-Dabashi Gray brochures, which amongst other things will give you my and Mohammed's contact details should you wish to address any specific questions to us separately. So I'll get started. Mohammed, to begin, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself, about your practice, how you got into it, what it is you get involved with, both in types of clients you deal with and geographies.
Thank you, Christopher, for this good introduction. As Chris mentioned, my name is Mohammed Al-Dabashi. I'm an Emirati lawyer. I'm not sure if I'm the only Emirati lawyer that has been to Jersey, but maybe one of the only, which is a beautiful. If you haven't been to Jersey, it kind of reminds you of London, but with different names. It's very weird, very odd, but it's the London of the Channel Islands. Anyways, so I think one should visit it just for the sake of seeing what's out there. So the reason I went to Jersey probably answers part of your question, but we had a client that was looking into structuring options through the UAE and had a few investments in Africa. And by structuring that, we were doing a bit of due diligence on certain structures offshore where the businesses can be located between the UAE, somewhere a bit more Western, and Africa. So my background is being a corporate commercial lawyer. Kind of started off my career. I went on to being a registered advocate in the UAE and started doing a lot of litigation after that. Kind of shifted into being focused on complex commercial litigation. And the reason I'm saying that is because with complex commercial litigation, that's where you usually try to untie certain complex structures that people have put in place. And then you start realizing where people have been doing a lot of, I would say, incorrect or not the best solutions when it comes to structuring options. And Jersey, I can say, is one of the options that are out there that kind of usually work. But my clients and for myself and our firm usually ask us to look into these structuring options, and that's where I got to meet Christopher and kind of kicked off there.
Okay. Very interesting. Now, we've discussed this many times before, obviously, but for the benefit of those listening, that maybe if you can just elaborate a bit more on the synergies between our businesses and what the sort of needs that your clients have that may give rise to the services that Fiduci offers.
Well, I kind of so I guess my answers will keep on touching based on each other, but I'll give a few examples that helps, and I think that generally puts it more in perception for people, where you get an individual that has spent all his lifetime career developing his wealth. Now, he might have started off with trading textiles, for example, and developed a bit of cash out of there, used a bit of his money to buy off some properties. Properties started developing, kind of expanded that to buying a business or developing more properties. Maybe, got a bit of decent wealth, bought a yacht to entertain himself, and a nice little house in London for his summer vacation, because it gets very hot in Dubai or the UAE. So that individual gets to a certain point where his assets and his wealth are all over the place. The properties are generating some wealth. The yacht is taking away a lot of that wealth because it's a very, very expensive toy. And the operating businesses are running at a certain way that they weren't running originally in the past 20 years, because the market has changed and Amazon has probably changed the grounds of his business. So this would be a typical family corporate structuring exercise, where you've got a few decent properties and assets in the UAE, and you have one or two luxury or maybe non-luxury items in certain Western jurisdictions. And what would you like to do with that, and how would you like to tie that all in one place? Because when you're alive and you're on top of it all, you kind of manage it all yourself. But then if you pass, what happens to these properties? Do you chop up these companies in little bits and pieces and have people fight over them? Do you take one flat that you've bought in downtown Dubai and draw lines between them? Obviously, if you have a license, then you get, if you have 5 people inheriting it, or you're going to have 5 people saying, who they should lease it out to, or who should they not lease it out to. So you get all sorts of these problems that start coming up. Now, if you have, I gave you an example, if you have one company and if you have one flat, how many problems that you can get out of, people starting to look in these structures. So what one should do is think of, putting it in a structure that is well governed and very well placed. And that's where I think the synergies usually come in place, because we start looking at these structures and looking at options where we look at certain jurisdictions where, because one of the properties is very well detached from the jurisdiction of something here, but you want to tie it all in one structure. I think that's where, fiducie and the Jersey type structure usually falls in place. Now, what's the risk of getting it all wrong? Obviously, and what if you don't do it right? Then you start. Actually, there are hundreds of risks of doing it wrong. One very obvious one people might know of is tax risks, and something that's not my topic or not my subject, but it's one very important angle. If you own properties abroad, and even in the UAE, there are certain taxes or certain that come in place, and you have to be aware of them and be aware of how the inheritance went past. I don't know if people here know, but if you have something in the UK, there's an inheritance tax, which probably takes half your wealth if it's passed in a I wouldn't say incorrect way, but in not the right structure. So these are angles people look at. Now, that's taking in consideration there is no dispute related, there are no people fighting wrong. But what if you'd want to, you have a few properties and, today, one and his siblings are sitting and they all have, play football together, and they fight over, who plays what movie over Netflix every night. But that's the last of their problems. And, the father comes in, puts food on the table at the end of the day, and that's pretty much it. The father passes, and they start realizing that there are properties that need management. There are company operations where there are very nitty-gritty details that people get into, where people need to take decisions, and everyone knocks on, like, who's the boss now? Who's going to take that decision? And I think who's entitled to what? One property could be valued. Okay, if you could have two apartments, both of them valued at $2 million today. So okay, each one takes an apartment, but then one apartment is generating an income of 100, and the other is generating an income of 20. So valuation doesn't really answer your question. And that's where I think structuring is very important, because if you get it wrong, then you start fighting over things, and then this profit generating item that you have, whether it's a property or it's a company, starts getting pulled down, getting deadlocked, and you end up not being able to generate any money out of it, and potentially bankrupting whatever you have if it was a corporate company. So what would that structure do for you? It would basically title and make sure that it's managed in a certain way, and when it's passed on to the next generation, it's passed on in a certain way that really works. Now, people would ask why, and I'd like to comment on that a little more later on, Christopher, but why I'll give you my answer why you would use Jersey type structures is purely because of two reasons. Number one, it's very high regulations. So you make sure that you have trustee advisors that are very heavily regulated, and because they've been doing it for a very long time, so they probably know what they're working with. And maybe a third good scenario is, or good option for that is because of the Western jurisdiction part. There are obviously many other things, but these are the things I look at for clients and make sure that to give them something that actually works. There are other points of Sharia compliance. Obviously, I'm Muslim. The majority of the Emirati population and a lot of our expats here are all Muslims. So when it comes to inheritance and passing on wealth, there is a huge Sharia flag that's raised out, and one important factor that people take into consideration, because just a quick 101, you can't really you can't, in Sharia, you can't really manage the title of your wealth after your death unless it's in a will. But you're very much entitled to give everything away during your lifetime. But what is meant by giving things away? Now, I'm not a Sharia scholar, so I'm not going to go into much details there. But I think one very critical point that usually comes up, a lot of people say, I don't mind giving things away and passing it to my heirs and having them split up the properties, or having a company that has a board and everyone gets his share and everyone is happy. But then comes the very critical point, which is control. And that is something that people really are cautious about, and how to retain control, how to manage control. And maybe also, Christopher, you can touch upon, how the trust works in Jersey, and how a beneficiary could manage, retain control if you want, and if someone would want to hear a bit more about that. But that just gives you, like the type of areas that people should be looking at. Now, that's a very contentious way of looking at it. That's a very dispute-related way of looking at it. But let's look at a non-contentious way of looking at it. You might be, as an individual, worth $100 million today. But what's worth $100 million? You've got maybe $10 million worth of properties, a few companies that have a turnover. If you put the EBITDA, whatever, on it, and then you get, the remaining 90 out of that. You'd like to retire. Now, this property is generating you $100,000 a year, and your company is purely running on turnover, and whatever money is coming in is really regenerating, and you get an income of a few $100,000 every year. So you're not really, you have a huge wealth, but you're not really retaining it, or you're not really entertaining it. And you get to a point where you're like, I've worked, I've built all of this. Now it's there. Now it has a number value to it. But what should I do with it today? I just die and let my kids fight over it. So And I think that's where you look into certain sophisticated structures where you kind of lump in your wealth as a whole type company, and you spin it off and you sell it. And I think that's a very commercial way of thinking, and basically cashing out, because it's always easier to deal with cash. You sell off your wealth, which could be valued separately if you detach it all at almost nothing. But once you lump it in all together, you would get that value out, and you could sell it off to a fund or whatever type of investor vehicle that would come and take out, and you retire and you enjoy the rest of your life in the Bahamas. Does that answer your questions, Christopher, or is there anything that I've?
No, I think that's pretty comprehensive, actually. Thank you very much. Thank you for that. I thought that the point on complying with Sharia inheritance rules was particularly interesting, because a lot of the time when I'm having conversations with potential clients in the region, one of the objections is that there's a presumption that the use of offshore structuring is to avoid those rules, but that's not the case. It's actually quite a good tool to implement them.
No, yeah, and I'll give you what we've done recently for some clients is because we can't really advise on the Sharia part, but what we do is we create a structure that could potentially work from a Sharia compliant point of view, and we go to the Awqaf, which is the registered scholar agency in the UAE, and we present that to them and try to get them to give a fatwa based on that structure, whether it works or not from a Sharia compliant point of view. And obviously the point you look at is what you're passing on and how you're retaining control and how it's being held under trust, etc. But I'll not bore everyone with the details here, but generally speaking, the point I'm trying to make is you shouldn't avoid the Sharia compliant part, because but you should address it with creating your structure in a way that works. At the end of the day, you find a solution and you take it to a registered agency, government related, whether you're in the UAE or elsewhere. This probably applies in whichever jurisdiction you are, and you get basically a sign off from them saying that this is something that works.
Very good. Yeah, makes sense to me. Well, maybe I'll just give you a bit of views from my angle and pick up on some of the points that you mentioned, if that makes sense. So just brief background.
There's a question. There's something. One thing that I didn't point out before jumping into details is something very important. Do you pronounce it Fiduci or Fiduci?
You can pronounce it however you like, man. That's the main rule, right? Whatever you prefer. That's how you pronounce it.
Because
sorry, go ahead.
I like to work with you guys because I think the name is cool. Other than that,
yeah. I was with someone the other day. Well, maybe a bit more further in the past than the other day, but who pronounced it Fidukai. So I don't think it gets more creative than that. But yeah. So anyway,
tell us more about it. Tell us more about and honestly, there's one thing that I still haven't got my head around is yachts and how you could help me become very rich in managing and owning my yacht through an offshore structure, so it doesn't get pulled out in a rent dispute for one of my properties in the UAE.
Yeah, so I mean, yachts is part of what we do. So we're essentially a trust, corporate services, fund services, employee services, and yacht services business, all 5 of them, with their head office in Jersey, in the Channel Islands, as you mentioned. We're an independent firm, so no institutional or other backing. 3 shareholder directors of the company. And we've got offices other than Jersey in London and Dubai. we set up the rep office here in Dubai about 1.5 years ago to focus on building up our Middle East business. And I think there's two major points that you raised that I'll address in a bit. But since you asked about yachts, I'll take that one first. So essentially, when you think, people think, oh, what are they doing? Employee services and taking care of yachts. It sounds a bit disparate. It does sound a bit disparate, but in effect, it's just it's all the same thing. It all boils down to effective administration of an asset, right? Whether that asset is a fund, whether it's shares in operating companies for a family, or whether it's a yacht. And so, the typical yacht structure, you'd have a company that owns the yacht and a separate company that employs the crew, and Fiduci takes care of all of the non-physical servicing of that yacht through the company that we administer. Dealing with all the payments that need to be made, paying the crew, dealing with the tax requirements, and everything that goes along with that. Equally, we help people who are looking to, like you in a few years, right? Looking to buy a boat, because the yacht world is very small. So, we know a number of brokers, we know the lawyers who can help execute these transactions. We know the relevant finance houses who can assist with that. And then importantly, once the boat's identified and bought, we ensure that the structure is such that it is as inexpensive as possible for that client to buy a boat. Taking advantage of certain areas of tax to limit the outflow, the outset of buying a boat. So that's the yachts. Other than the yachts, we do, a lot of what we do, especially in the Middle East, is what you spend some time talking about, which is structuring for families and their businesses. Traditionally we say, we have two separate service lines, private client and corporate. In the Middle East, private client and corporate are essentially one and the same, because every private client has a big company he owns, and every big company in the Middle East, other than a few listed ones or government owned, are generally owned by wealthy families. And I'll come back to that in a minute, because I think I want to talk about your point about the retention of control on those structures. But other than that, we get involved. We have a funds business, so we can set up and administer funds for Middle East asset managers who are investing outside of the region. Jersey private funds are a very cost-effective vehicle to use for those sorts of investments. And the employee services is something that traditionally has been very, Western focused, setting up pension plans and saving schemes for employees, in the UK and Europe. But, I think the Middle East is moving towards a more formal way of remunerating employees, especially when they leave the business, or even while they're still there. In the way of share plans and the like. And I think the UAE is leading the way on that in the region, especially with the first scheme being put in place in the DIFC. And we will be a part of that as that environment of employee services grows in the Middle East.
But can I ask you? So given you're in charge of the region in Fiduci, so you kind of not only see the UAE but Saudi Arabia and the Gulf in its entirety. And what trends have you been seeing in the last few months or last year or so, excluding the fact of Corona and all that? We're pretty much over.
Yeah.
But but it just.
Well, fingers crossed.
But yeah, what trends have you been seeing? And also, like, from an educational point of view, I don't know how the client base has been, because I know we're a very new market to such type of services. Although 1,400 years ago, our religion kind of imposed the foundations of having a trust and having things governed by a trust. It was never really developed in this part of the world until recently by the likes of the IFC and ATGM. So what have you been seeing recently in the last few months?
It's really varied. I think if I look at the different areas of our business, that there are trends within those. There's no sort of overarching trend. In the funds business, what I've seen a lot of is, established Middle East asset managers, whether UAE or Saudi based generally, who have traditionally focused on Middle East investments or Middle East clients. They are beginning to look outside of the region to diversify the risk in their portfolios and their clients' portfolios. So that's one trend I've seen, and that's an area where we've been quite active in assisting some of them to do that through this Jersey Private Funds Group. The employee services, I spoke about, that's quite nascent in the region, but and again, I see the UAE leading that, and so that's a trend that will continue to grow. Within the private client and corporate structuring space, I think the name of the game all across the region is asset protection. It's very nice that we can help people with succession planning and find tax benefits for certain assets they might have outside the region, but the real driver for clients in the region to have a structure, rightly or wrongly, is I don't see it as being necessarily governance or succession planning, although those are essential to the good running of that structure once it's established. But I see the real driver being asset protection. People want to ensure that as the world gets more complex, legally, fiscally, that the assets that they have outside of the GCC are in a way ring-fenced from what they have closer to home, and vice versa, so that because the big families and businesses here will have enough exposure to the geopolitical risk of the region. They don't need to add on to that by having the assets that they have outside be in their personal name while they're also here. And that's really the major trend I've seen in that space, is people wanting to protect the assets that they have. And a lot of the times they don't know quite how or why, but when you sort of drill down into it, that seems to be the main driver.
Can I give a point on asset protection, because a lot of people don't really get into understanding. So why do I need to protect my assets? You're going to change the order, from Mohammed Jersey Trustco, or from Mohammed Dahbashi as an individual to MD Jersey Trustco, and what that may. But I'll give you a very live example of how one way of protection, or one thing you could protect from. Imagine you own a lot of properties here and there. You have this nice luxurious villa that you bought with your life savings, and you've got a few commercial shops, down the road in Dubai, where people are selling shawarma and paratha out of it, and one of your shops, causes a fire to that building. Insurance company says, well, it's not our fault, it's the landlord's fault, because he hasn't fixed a little pipe down the drain somewhere, which you might have just not been aware of. And someone comes after you for 20 million dirhams, the value of that building and the land, and loss of profits. something that's pretty much out of your hand.
Sure.
Whoever comes after you for that will have a judgment to enforce on, and having a judgment to enforce on. Now, well, the building is liable. That company running the building should be liable, but you personally shouldn't be liable for that. And if you are not protected there, and if you own that building under your personal name, and if your house is owned by your personal name, that's what Chris was saying about ring fencing. That's one way of ring fencing things. So he's obviously mentioning ring fencing between different jurisdictions, but if you ring fence them out of each other, then they will almost never be able to enforce against that villa that you have, because that's something is separate than that little shawarma business in Dubai or a few shops. And that's where you protect, that's how you protect your assets. It's not, it's like putting guards out and building fences just to make sure that, and legal structures just to make sure that people do not penetrate it or do not try to use the law to unlawfully claim money that they shouldn't be entitled to. Can you give us, I think, Christopher, a live example of a live case that you're working on? Obviously, mention the client name, please, and where his property, where his Aegon. With all confidentiality, just give us a live example of something in the UAE. I think just so people know how it actually works. Like just one quick example, I think that.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, if you look at, so there's a UAE family that we're working with at the moment, and they're sort of fit into the description that you gave before. Assets in the West, both business as well as private, and then some businesses here and real estate here and real estate abroad and all. And the main driver for the principal of this family was asset protection, whilst realizing that he also needed to put in place a succession planning, within the family. And then came the conversation of protection versus control, and how do these balance out? And also the case of GCC assets and global assets. And yes, we want to protect them from each other, but equally we want them to be governed together. So for that, in that scenario, what we're doing is we're putting in place a private trust company in Jersey, which will hold a few trusts for the family, and that side of the structure will own all the majority, where there's no huge tax disadvantage. Will own the majority of the non-GCC assets, and that will all be governed from the top by the private trust company, of which the principal will sit on the board with a couple of his advisors. Alongside that, we are looking to set up an ADGM foundation, which will own the majority, again, not all, but the majority of the GCC-based assets, real estate and otherwise.
And the GCC and the ADGM Foundation was capable of having these properties being transferred to them in the GCC.
Yeah. Well, Dubai and Abu Dhabi, real estate. Yeah. And then we come back to the question of the governance and the control. And there's no point in having two separate, strands of governance if you're going through this whole exercise. So on the council of the ADGM Foundation, will essentially be run by the Jersey Private Trust Company, again, of which the principal is on the board. So he retains control from the top, but in one place. It doesn't have to be split. So that is, that's one live case. I think maybe just I'll mention one other just briefly, which is, Dubai is a great place for entrepreneurs, right? It's people come here, start businesses. I think there's a lot of small, medium businesses here. So we're working with one DMCC based company, which has grown to the point where it doesn't really make sense for them to be using that entity for all of the services they're offering. The operational bit for the UAE needs to be in there. And they also don't want to keep all their capital here, and they want to raise funds. So what we're doing for them is putting in place a holding entity in Jersey, to which they can feed up the capital, right, to keep that in a separate jurisdiction. They can then use that vehicle also as a fundraising vehicle for the next series of raise. And under that company, we'll set up a separate entity also in Jersey, which they can use as their sort of advisory business, rather than running everything through the Dubai company when it's simply not required. So again, it's just about diversifying risk, right? There's nothing wrong with the DMCC company. It's been very good for them. They set it up, they built their business in the region. But at a certain point, it makes sense to put a governance structure in place and diversify the risk. So
those are makes sense. It goes back to my I think original point of saying Jersey being a regulated place. If you would like to move governance away to somewhere like Jersey, I think that's one of the main benefits you get out of being. Yeah. What do you think, Chris? I don't like these things to go on for too long.
I agree. Yeah. Let's see. If anyone has any questions, we'll give you a minute or so to type them in. If not, we will say goodbye. In the meantime, while we're waiting to see if anyone types one in, I've got one question for you. You kind of alluded to it, but you danced around it a bit. What to you, you sort of indicated what makes Jersey an attractive jurisdiction, but what to you makes Jersey a more attractive jurisdiction than others that people could use for offshore services?
Well, I'll be very frank and honest with you, Christopher, but it's having people on ground. Yeah. But yeah, that is actually the correct answer. Having people on ground. Having people on ground here is because there are a lot of offshore jurisdictions, some better than others, all competing when it comes to fees. But it's having people assist you there and having people on ground here. For example, if you deal with the BVI, not saying anything about it, if anything, BVI is a good jurisdiction, but it's the time difference between the UAE and the BVI is painful. And having people here sorting stuff out on the BVI, 9 hours time difference, it's just that and I think Jersey sits in a very nice time zone, very similar to London, and I think it's probably as like London, the UK, and having people on ground here. You've got people like Jersey Finance, promoting and helping out people. These things make a difference for your clients, because at the end of the day, if you want to buy a Bentley, you want to see its dealer here. It's being manufactured, whatever, but you want to go to the dealer here. And similarly, you don't buy cars or you don't buy products that you don't see the people that are actually behind it, or they something presenting it to you. I will always have limited knowledge about Jersey or any other jurisdiction because it's out of my scope. And whatever asking or using such type of interesting structures for clients, I'd like the person that I promote or request for, is here with me to assist these clients. So I can just say, speak to them, meet with them, and I think that's times, Christopher, where I just ask, just send out, speak to Christopher, and if he can answer this question, then that's it, rather than going through, let me introduce you to that firm in Jersey instead of meeting, in 100 years. I think I have a question for me.
Yeah, there is one question for you, yeah.
And so what is the status of regulations on 100% ownership of companies in mainland UAE, and eliminating the requirement of 51% UAE national? Now, this is a very sensitive topic, and I'm not going to speak about politics, but the UAE government, there's a reason why ownership of companies requires a majority stakeholding of Emiratis. It comes back to very historical reasons of these companies being treated like that could acquire properties and acquire land, where being a very small country, if you get, and the Emirati population is pretty minimal. It's around, I think it's a bit below 10% of the actual population. So if you give away the entire control of all the companies operating in the country, and if you give away the properties in the country, then you pretty much have given away the country itself. But similarly speaking, we as a government, I think it's always promoting foreign investment and foreign direct investment coming into the UAE. They've done very well with setting up the offshore jurisdiction structure, the free zone structures of having someone with the comfort of owning that. Now, these come with certain restrictions. So I think to answer your question, what will probably happen is that they will allow certain activities to operate without an Emirati. So just to increase that vicinity where free zones operate, where yes, okay, the free zone can have operations in the UAE or on ground, onshore, but certain activities that are not very sensitive and that are not very, and do not really penetrate the economy. But will it be lifted anytime soon and give full 100% ownership of expats overnight? I pretty much doubt it, because the economy has been built that way, and it's very difficult to backtrack on that. But I think what they will do is they just keep on increasing incentives to having that comfort of welcoming investment, foreign investment in the UAE. Do you think that answers the question, Mr. Ferdinand?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yeah, I think if the
No, just
I think it makes it different. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Question to just answer him. No, it's not yet executed. He's asking if it's executed or the regulation is executed. Right. No, it hasn't been executed, and there has been talks about it, but nothing. We haven't seen anything firm in place, so we're not really. So I think one shouldn't bother with it until he sees a firm execution process, because when a regulation is passed, then there is a timeline of change.
Well, the only thing I would add to that is sort of, without responding to the question directly, is that those minority shareholders, those expatriate shareholders, there are many mechanisms by which they can protect their minority shareholder, and some of which is the things that we've alluded to in our conversation today. So that's the only thing I would add. Let's see. Do we have any other questions? I don't think so. Let's let everyone get on with their day. I think they've heard enough of both of us for one day. So
no more questions. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you very much.
I hope next time we have more interesting topics. Honestly, next time, Christopher, please have some pictures of yachts, just to look at while speaking about these things.
Well, next time, hopefully, we can go. We can be in person, and if the boat show goes ahead in November, then we'll be on a boat.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Christopher.
All right. Thank you very much, Mohammed.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Bye.